Hi, I'm Donna from Evoker, and this tutorial is going to be focusing on creating the UV coordinates for our character so we can apply a texture to it. So to do that, we're going to use a checker map in order to make sure that there is no stretching on our character. So we'll create a new material here, so I'm just going to call it UV checker, and I'll apply a bitmap. And this is just the UV grid numbers. Okay, this will be supplied in the learning material, and you can see once I hit open that each one of those squares is a square and they're numbered. So I'm just going to adjust the tiling here. This will be how much it'll tile or repeat across the surface of the model. I find a smaller square is easier to map, and then I'm going to apply this to the boot. So as you can see, as we get close, that we can't see any of the squares. It's just one giant kind of stretchy clown boot. I don't know. So what the idea is to make sure that each one of these sections where you can see the square, and we want to get it as perfectly square as possible. So I'm going to select these faces here after applying a UVW map. You can find that in the modifier drop-down list, and then I'm going to apply a planar projection, and I'm going to align that to Z. Okay, so if we flip around to the bottom, we can still see that even though we can now read the numbers, the squares are not square, they're more rectangular. So we're going to open up our UV editor, and that'll bring up a little pop-up box. I'll drag that over here. There we go. And you can see that we've got kind of like a sole shape, a boot shape, but it is squished to fit into that one-to-one square. Now eventually we want all of our map laid out UV coordinates to fit in within this square, but for now, while we're mapping, we're not going to worry too much about where it lies. So I'm going to use the edge mode here. No. I'm going to grab, so with the bottom of our boot selected, I'm going to hit the quick peel, and you'll see that everything becomes nice and neatly squared off. So all those little numbers are now legible, and each one of the squares is square. So there we go. If I shrink that down, you can see it a little bit more clearer. And that is the objective. So we want that to happen all over our boot. Okay, so now we've done the grip, or the bottom of our boot. We continue on with the rest of the boot. So I'm going to start with the upper sole here, I guess you would call it. And we're going to select all of these bits again. So just continuing around the whole boot and selecting the upper sole, so just the top of the sole here. Okay, once that's done, I will apply a planar projection to it again. So just hitting the planar and lining it in the Y this time. No, the X looks better. There we go. And again, just like the bottom of the boot, we have that same problem. So the numbers aren't legible. Everything is stretched to fit into the one-to-one square. So that's not what we want. We also don't want the two edges to be on top of each other. What we want to do is lay this out so that we can see, like, kind of like peeling it. So we want to peel it apart to lay it out correctly. To do that, we need to apply a seam. So we need to select an edge where the seam would be. So where the green lines are that you can see here, the highlighted green, that is called a seam. and it's where two UV sets combine. So we want to place our seams in places that are illogical. So like when it's a shirt, you want to put it on where the shirt seam would naturally lie, or you want to try and hide it as much as possible. Here I'm just putting it at the front near the corner of the boot, since I don't normally, I would put it at the back of the heel, which I might actually do. So I'll go in here and I'll select these edges here, and I'll go Tool, Break, and that will make that seam there. So you can see now that the shell is, if I quick peel both of them, they're two separate shells. So I'm going to just bring this up and try and get them to be the same size as each other. So just looking in the viewport and making sure that the squares are about the same size on both halves. That looks about right. So maybe just a little bit more. So this is what we call making it uniform. So making the squares as square as possible on both halves, so they want them to match. Once that is done, I'm just going to move it out so I can see it. Just checking and to make sure, yep, that looks pretty good. So all the numbers are legible and the squares are square. So we can go in and we can sew these back together. So I'm going to use my edge, so just the little, make sure that my element isn't selected. So that's the box with the tick in it, so just turning that off. And I'll select these edges and I'll go Tool, Stitch Selected. When that pop-up comes up, you can hit OK, or you can because I've already scaled them, I'm going to take off Scale Cluster, but you can see in the viewport how that affects the UVs. And there we go, so we've peeled off the bottom of our boot, so the sole is completely peeled and ready to go. So I'm just going to move, and you'll also see that this is now one element again. I'll shrink that down a little bit. And move it out the side so we can continue on. So you can see they're all big and square. So we can continue to create the UVs for our boot. So I'm going to select the rest of the boot here, and I'll apply the planar projection again in the X. So you can see across the top of the boot it's all stretchy, and at the back as well, but the side of the boot, all the numbers are legible and the square is square. This is because it's projecting from the plane, so it's trying to project both halves together. So where it stretches across the top, you're obviously going to get distortion. And this is obviously not what we want when we're trying to texture something. We want everything to be as uniform as possible. So again, using my edge, just select the edges that I want here. So I'm going to make the seam at the back of the boot here. Make sure I deselect these ones down here since I've already done those. I'm going to break these, so Tool, Break, so that will create the seam at the back of the boot. Okay. You got to remember, whenever we create a seam, we're going to have to apply a texture, so we want to put it in an area that isn't visible. So if we do, when we create our texture, we can hide that seam, so if something doesn't quite line up as much as it should, it's not as visible. So I'm also going to create a seam here and quick peel that. I'll just move that over to the side. So I'm doing it in sections so that I can join them all again later, but I find that If I do it in sections, I get a better result with less stretching. Okay, everybody will do it differently, but I'm showing you the quickest way I know how to do it. So again, marking out the edge of the seam and hitting quick peel. And for the front of the boot, I will mark out one final seam here and break that, and again selecting the element and using quick peel. There we go. So the shaft of the boot is now mapped. Now we just need to map this part of the boot here, the front or the toe, and okay, that's looking pretty good. There is a little bit of stretching around the toe because of the way it curves. And on the lip of the boot as well, but we're not going to worry about the lip because it is the lip of the boot and it is not going to be seen underneath the pants. So now we can start to try and join some of these together, because we don't want to keep them separate like this. It makes texturing it a nightmare. If we texture it like this, we need to make sure that everything lines up, that all our patterns aren't visible, so when they go over the edge of the UVs, it becomes a nightmare if we don't. Seams become visible, and it does not look pleasing in game. Okay, so continuing on the other side, we'll select all the way down the edge of this boot here, and we'll stitch selected again and hit OK. So we'll just check to make sure that hasn't caused too much stretching. There is a little bit as it curves around the heel, but that is not enough to worry about. So curved areas will always have a little bit of warping. There's not much we can do about that, unless you break it up or have more seams. But again, we don't want to do that. So I'm just going to keep the seam here at the side of the boot. Now if our boot had laces or something like some other detail like that, we'd be able to hide the seam underneath those laces, so we wouldn't have to worry too much about matching our textures together. But this one doesn't, so we need to make sure that they're in places that aren't going to be as visible. And since most games, the character is seen from either up and behind, the front of the boot isn't. We're not going to have to worry too much about the front of the boot, but in this case I'm going to actually break this section off so I can start to attach the bottom of the front part of our boot. But before I do that, I'm going to prepare the front part of our boot a little bit more by splitting the toe. See, if you can look at the toe here, there's quite a bit of stretching at the moment, so if I'm going to, by applying these new seams and applying another quick peel, you can see how the stretching is eliminated. So I'm going to make sure my element isn't on, and I'll select these two edges here and stitch selected and then hit OK to join that up. Okay, so I'm just going to select these now and move them up out of the way, and I think I might actually adjust where that seam lies. So I'm just going to go in here now and select these edges because I'm not quite happy where that seam is lying at the front of the boot there. And I'll take off my element so I can join these edges up. So all the way down, sitting stitch and hitting OK. And then, yeah, I'm just checking to see if this would be the better place. So yep, I'll stitch these ones together as well, so just all the way down to the bottom of the sole, or the top of the sole. Okay, you may not always put the seams in the same place at the same on every mesh that you make, so every boot you make may not have the seam down the side here. It all depends on the boot and where the best place it would be to hide the seam. In this case, because we've got the detail at the back with the strip, the leather strip, it might, and there's a seam at the side of the boot here, we can carry that up so that it will be a better place to put it here. And again on the other side, I think I'll do that as well. So just breaking first I've got to break this seam first, so selecting these edges and hitting, going to Tools, Break, or you can hit Control B as well, which is the keyboard shortcut, and then selecting these edges and hitting Stitch, hitting OK. And then stitching these ones as well. So just using the stitch selected there on the toolbar, and applying a quick peel again to make sure we can lay it out. So just checking to make sure that the stretching isn't bad. So there we go, that looks pretty good. So again, it will depend on the type of shoe that you're using as to where you're putting the seams. As long as you place them in a place that is logical. So around the sole of the boot, we've got one around the edge of the boot, we can hide that in a shadow. On the shaft of the boot, we're trying to hide it on the side so it won't be seen too much from in-game. So once we're done and we're happy with that, we collapse our UV so that applies the UVs to the mesh. And we can continue on to the next part of our body. Okay, so we'll move on with our pants. So just, I've hidden everything. This is just an ease of use for me, and applied the material to the pants. So again, the same way. This time I'm going to select the entire element and apply just a planar projection on the Y. A lot of the steps are the same, so in some areas we will just speed up the process, speed up the video, rather than having to show you the same steps over and over again. But here we go, so we'll bring up our UV editor so that we can see it. We can see how it's been squished into the 1-to-1 square there, and we've got some horrible stretching along the side. So again, like with the boot, we want to pick places where the seams are a logical point, so they're going to be less noticeable. In the case of the pants, it's going to be down the side of the leg where the natural seam will lie. So hopefully this will be hidden by our seams that we created in our pants, but then we can also we can hide within that seam. And we'll also do one around the center of the body here as well. So just selecting this edge with the edge tools there, so using the green line, which is the edge button, and the one next to it is the ring. So this will get the edge loop. So selecting the loop all the way down the left side of the leg, and on the inside as well. Thankfully that one was all a loop, so we don't have to go and select every single edge together. And on the other side as well. So selecting that. Once we have that all selected, we can break that and then do a quick peel. So I'll select the front here and hit quick peel. So there we go. Now you can see how when I've done it on the back of the leg, around the knee area is quite small, which means if I turn around the back, the square there is also quite large. This means that less detail will be in that area, so we want to make sure that all the squares are basically the same size over the entire leg. To do that, I'm going to break this seam here, and we'll project them each separately. So just breaking that seam, or creating that seam by breaking the UVs there, selecting them and doing a quick peel on their own. And then I'll just scale them up, trying to match them to the UVs that are already created on that leg. So just using the viewport as a guide and trying to match up the grid and the size of the squares. So again with the other leg, applying the quick peel and then scaling. Just trying to match the size of the squares. Okay, once we're happy with that, we can go back in, making sure our element is off, and select the edges and stitch them together. So just tool, stitch selected. Make sure scale is off. So I'm just seeing how that adjusts it in the viewport. So there we go. I'm hitting OK. Then I'm just going to move these up again and out of the way. And that would be our pant and boot done. UVs have been laid out and ready for texture. So on to the next part of the body.